Hello, everybody. Achilles Justice here. The Philosophy Society, September 27th. We're at Toronto Metropolitan University Library, room 662. We have a new member today, which is great, and our old members. Okay, so Rene Descartes is like the first skeptic, right? So he was coming at the discussions of like God and, you know, the philosophical questions of the time. And he wanted to kind of question everything. He wanted to go back to what he would say is first principles, right? And so the general quote from Descartes that's like very standard is, I think, that the colloquial one is, I think, therefore I am. But in the text, he says, I think I am, right? So the only thing he can know, look at the marker size, or I think, therefore I exist. It's because I'm a thinking being, that is like the very basic fundamental property that I can house my knowledge in, right? And so he was like one of the first skeptics. And so taking this skeptical approach, or kind of distill away, or at least just put on pause the beliefs that we have, the things that we do in our life, what is like the most core basic properties we can derive from our experience. So in some ways we're being empirical, right? So knowledge from my experience. Not strictly sense experience, but just experience in general. What can I know from my experience, and how can I utilize that knowledge or those properties in a way to increase my well-being or to make my life better? One thing that we can start basically is that I am perceiving stuff, or there is a perceiver. And we can just like kind of exemplify that by putting a person and they're perceiving something. So there's some perception going on, and which is also a function of my awareness. However, perception has some form of interpretation to it. I'm putting some kind of meaning on whatever information is coming in, right? So there may be other elements of my awareness that are not necessarily being perceived yet, and that's where we get like sensation. So I can like feel the object, and that's how my brain is detecting the information. And then there's how I interpret what it is, which would be my perception of it, right? So we have sensation, perception. Going from that, that's really just the body and the environment in some ways, right? We have that right now. So a lot of the times these kind of like thought experiments or tests, we want to be able to kind of demonstrate it in the moment. And I think that would give it some more almost credit, or it would give us a sense that it's not just something I'm making up. You want to say something? Okay. So other things we have going on is I may have like a belief about things, or we have our self-talk or our narrative, right? So going with this thing, so we have self-talk or narrative, and then from that, there are beliefs within it. And within these beliefs, there's going to be a whole set of things that are going on there that may be true or false. And we can be philosophical and we can skip all this stuff and just dive right into that, right? Into concepts and the nature of them. And there's a whole bunch of arguments in history of philosophy. It's not really where we're going for right now, but that's there. So going back one step, so we do know that we exist right now. And from this existence, we have certain properties. One would be awareness. We can have awareness of our sense perceptions. The other one is the awareness of this internal dialogue or narrative, right? Now, some people, they can perceive their internal dialogue as other voices. And then we get the phenomena of like thinking people are talking to you that are outside of your body, which is something like a symptom of schizophrenia, right? And so there may be some neurological issue for some individuals where they think that they're hallucinating voices, but really what's going on is just their own voice, right? There's just a confusion here. So through our existence, we have this awareness, we have our sense perception, We have our self-talk. What else is going on? But we do have the external world. From the external world, there's some interaction with that, from the body to the environment. And so there's a degree of self-sustaining habits and behaviors that we have an internal motivation and drive for. We have instincts for that, like eating and sleeping, right? And then there are things in our physical environment, like building shelter, that may not be as intuitive as those other drives, but they definitely will promote our survival and increase our well-being. The belief, or at least a linguistic informational content, how I see things and how I can conceptualize information, can help us out with, I don't like using the word manipulation, but manipulating the environment, exercising some control over and having to create some kind of taking something from within the mind and creating it out in the external world, right? You can see something and then utilize it. So I might see a rock and I can sit on it. I didn't create the rock to be a certain height, but it does serve some function for me. From this point, right, body environment, then we have also the existence of others, right? And they are in some ways a mirror reflection of all of this content. We also have emotions in here. There are other properties too, right? And relative to how the properties within the self and the environment and others, we start to get a sense of our well-being. So for a specific end, we have our well-being here. What we can do is we can observe within each category what's going on, and then we can utilize our decision-making faculty, right, to direct how we're interacting with each of these properties or how they interact within us, right? And fundamentally, when we're going throughout our lives, the awareness function is like the most important one. If you can at least be aware, like for example, something upsets you, right? Or you had some goal in a social interaction and maybe you didn't meet that goal, you know? And what you can do is you can approximate and through effort, get yourself to either remove the negative property or increase the existing property of something that you want to be at. Right?
There are two categories of awareness and narration or self-talk narrative. Is that right? Awareness and narrative.
So yeah, the self-talk, which is also a narrative, because the self-talk can be momentary, but the narrative is something that's been going on over time. So it's the story that you tell yourself about yourself.
So these are the basic two categories, and then awareness gets divided into two categories of sensation and perception now. Is that
awareness,
right?
We can be aware of all of these things, including others. So first we have our existence is derived from the awareness. If you didn't have awareness, you couldn't know you exist. So awareness is like one of them. It is the fundamental, like being alive is super fundamental. And then the next part is being conscious. If you don't have the element of consciousness, then it's like you almost got nothing. You know, that which makes you, the essence of you being human to its full degree, is embedded in being a conscious being.
Okay, so it's sort of it looks like a sort of a hierarchy called first existence, then awareness, then after that it comes to sort of like a hierarchical movement. It looks like from existence, awareness, and then that narrative.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the self-talk and the narrative is something that you can have about all of these other properties. And the thing about the self-talk and the narrative, so last year I taught a book called Feeling Good by a psychiatrist, and it's basically, we're looking at the philosophy of cognitive behavioral therapy. And the principle is just that we can have distorted perception or distorted, so this can be distorted, our perception of the world, or our self-talk or our beliefs can be distorted. So for example, and that can lead to things like depression, anger, anxiety, right? So being aware of the distortion is the first step. Like this woman, her son was failing in school and she's like, I'm a bad mother. And then she got super depressed and upset because of the belief that she was a bad mother, and then reinforced that belief through her observations and picking out specific information and stuff. So the awareness is the first step. And then from that, there's a degree of like, when we go back to being empirical, right? And then we discuss the nature of science, right? It's how do we determine the soundness of the information that we have, right? So when it comes to the sense perception, you know, that is our mind slash brain deriving information from its environment or internally. And so there's a degree of skill in ensuring the integrity and soundness of the way that we perceive the world or what we're saying to ourselves. And that in some ways is like being objective, you know? It's that if we both looked at the same thing, we would come to the same understanding. Whereas if one person, they're the only ones that think that, it is subjective or related to them alone. Yeah. When we say science, there's a certain soundness of information. So this is kind of like I went through this more than once. Okay, so let's just do another map here. So we have the individual, and one other thing that we want to talk about is identity. Like who or what are you, you know? And that's directly related to the narrative thing, beliefs and then identity. So there's a whole bunch of properties. So if this is the present moment, there's a bunch of stuff that happened before this moment that is directly related to who you are, right? So there's like, there's biological things, just like your DNA, like your ethnicity kind of. I guess ethnicity is more cultural. So biological, sociocultural. We could say values also goes under sociocultural. And then we have psychological. So there's certain properties that will occur before you were even born, right? Like I had no choice for my European background. That's when I became conscious, right? This notion of existing and being aware of myself. Remember, I was like, what am I? Am I a thing? Like maybe I was 7 or however, whatever age that was. There's a bunch of stuff I couldn't control. There's just things I can't do anything about, right? It's not contingent on, like, the value of my identity is not limited to that which is out of my control, right? People don't, if someone judges you based on those properties, that's where we get like certain biases like racism or prejudice, right? And those are bad. So we don't judge people based on those things. We judge them based on their character. It's like, what do you do, right? What kind of person are you, right? So certain psychological things, we can say like your attachment style, like how you interact with a romantic partner. Are you like avoidant? You like don't want to get too close. You're relatively stable. You're like, it doesn't matter if they come or go, I'm good to go regardless. Or you're very attached, and then you kind of like push away sometimes, right? Or disorganized. So that's something that's going to happen when you're in the first few years of life, depending on how your parents interact with you. So again, completely out of your control, nothing you can do, right? But once we get to the point of awareness, so there's one big factor here is behavior / habits, right? And I almost want to say that there's like a law. You know, you talk about laws in psychology, but I'm gonna use the term, right? That and how I structure this is definitely going to be up for discussion, but something along the lines of like neuron. We can just use the principle: neurons that fire together wire together, right? So that's a pretty easy one. And the point of that is that every time I'm kind of doing something, whether I decide to or not, in some ways I'm slowly building a habit for that thing, right? Whether I'm aware of it or not. And so it's important to exercise some self-control. So we have the self-talk thing, and then at some point, we have our executive function or we have our self-control. So those markers suck, right? And that's going to be something that we're going to utilize towards our habits and stuff. So this is the past, and then our present, and then where we're going. And so the future is going to fall into the category of this narrative. It's some goal that either I have determined for myself or from the socio-cultural framework, maybe my parents said something, or people at the workplace. They're like, we want you to get to this point, and we're going to monitor you for 6 weeks or 6 months, and then give you another 360 report and see how you're doing. right? And you have to do this process and they see how well you're doing. Your productivity sucks or it's good, boom, that's what they want, right? In the present moment, you can utilize this kind of map, something like this. I can structure it a little bit differently so it's more hierarchical, but I'm kind of just throwing them, just so I don't forget the ideas. And then that way, through the properties of your biological, sociocultural, and psychological, you can manipulate them or control them in such a way that you can reach certain goals that are at least realistic. And so the realistic goal, so one, the soundness of information, that's relative to empirical data, right? But then we can also have like a philosophical data, which just means it has to be reasonable. Or it's like a principle, So we may not have experience necessarily in this specific area, but we can reason, is it even possible? Is it contradictory, for example, right? And if it's contradictory, it doesn't make sense to go through it. Or if it's just delusional, it doesn't make sense to go through it. If you're disregarding the empirical information, right? And that's going to be a problem of the belief system and slightly behavior, right? So in the problem list, one could be delusions. Those aren't good. We don't want those, right? We want the being, this person, which is us, to have an accurate evaluation of its environment and of itself, and then also be aware of the others. Like, whoa. You could just chill in your room like a monk and meditate all day. Maybe that'll work for a little while, but you do need to interact with the environment to some degree. We have to go out there and do something. You know what I mean? And your well-being will increase relative to having like pro-social behaviors. You'll feel good with people, right? When you do good things, usually. Some people, maybe not, like if they have antisocial personality disorder, and that's the thing in itself. The reason we talk about all this stuff is because it's a general question. This is the thing that you use to solve that question, right? And so because different people, so this is one thing. When we talked about meaning in life, we brought this up before, there was 3 properties of it, right? Purpose, coherence, and significance, right? And so so we say, what do I do? Some things we do may not be that meaningful. For example, if I go like this, it is still even in the way of me kicking it. If I move it over there, at least it's not a trip hazard anymore. But me moving it like an inch, some people that derive extreme meaning from, inconsequential behaviors and habits, we could almost say like, well, is it really meaningful in some ways? Like, again, like schizophrenia, you can have certain catatonic situations, right? So a purpose is a future-oriented goal. The value of the goal increases based on 2 things. If it fits within our identity, and our identity is coherent, right? Going back to this thing, but I've found a way that even though these things aren't in my control, how they map over to the realm of my control, then I can change the trajectory in some ways. Once it gets there, I can kind of put effort into changing I have all these different properties. And then what will happen is that, again, in the human condition, in this cosmos, we perceive time going forward, right? So then the current future will be the present at some point. So the new present, so for example, the now is the present, and then there's the future, which is now the present, right? So the next present moment, because it keeps on going this way, as I experience it right here, we can change things. So it's like talking about your future self. So when you feel like shit today, you're like, whatever that might be, right? You can invest in the future self. So for example, exercising. It may not feel good in the moment, or I'm just like a little tired or whatever, but my future self will appreciate that, which is a weird way to think about it, but it is the thing. And so exercising control over the properties of the self via my awareness isn't always necessarily for the present self. So what we have is we have like the big self, and then we have like the small self. The big self is the total self. The small self is like the present self, right? And so the total self is an accumulation of all selves. And you could even say, like, I can use a different word. The being is not only the things I experience, but what you perceive too, right? So there's Aristotle, the philosopher. Aristotle had certain selves, like he had a morning self. He had a different form of expression when he was maybe playing with his kids, or when he was teaching Alexander the Great, or when he was listening to Plato, right? But then there's what we say about him, like his legacy, you can say. And that's still part of his self, right? What people say about you when you're not around is still kind of part of you because it's directed to you. So there's the self, there's the self as a property, and there's the things that are within the control of that particular being. But then there is other individuals that will communicate about that specific person. And so the total unit of all the information relative to that thing is a thing. Then there's also all of the information relative to that thing can perceive and is doing. But I'm like, for example, there may be someone talking about me right now. I'm not aware of it though. But it's still relative to this self. Right? So every present self is like this right here. Okay? And it is contingent. The me of right now, so around on the camera, the me of right now is contingent to all the things that happened before this moment. And those contingencies are these properties, and maybe a bit more. I maybe forgot a couple more. And so what I can do is I can utilize these properties to have like an integrated, like cross-referencing and manipulation. So I use these ones to change that one, and I use these ones to change that one, and I move through it almost like a matrix or like a system. And what happens is they slowly increase. Maybe one of them goes down a little bit as I increase another one, but you can manage this. And then the present self will change into a new future self. And so you'll get this trajectory over time, right? As over the total self, all of these present selves will slowly increase. And so, see how this yellow one? I think the yellow one's the best one. I was giving him a criticism. I was like, don't give me the yellow one because the yellow, I can't see the yellow one. The yellow one's the best one. Let's see it. Do you see the yellow? Probably not. You guys can see it, but I don't know if they can see it. Okay. Okay, so what are the flaws with this idea, like with the map, right? So the first thing is the self, okay, not problems, but what is important? Let's talk about that first. What's important is the idea of the self, of our total self, and then the immediate self, right? That in the moment. And the other thing is the understanding of our identity, how our identity changes over time, whether we like it or not. And so the best thing is to exercise some control over the direction of what you're becoming, right? So this might be a lot for you because I'm just like bombarding you with a bunch of ideas because it's your first day, but we've been on this kind of dialogue for a few months now. You can catch up. All these the videos are posted on YouTube. Did I send you a link to the YouTube thing? Okay. How can this, so what do you guys think? How does this system fail? For who does it fail for?
So I was thinking,
Or
what came to mind is, is there a way to reconcile past, future, and present? Sort of like, because I think what I heard you saying is that, well, some of the things we do is for our future self, like we exercise because maybe we don't feel like doing it right now. If you're just thinking about present, it doesn't make sense to exercise, right? So it's like sometimes when we are tired and we don't feel like it. So we think about the future in those instances that we don't really feel like doing something and we push ourselves. So it's like, okay, so the distinction between present and future allows us to do something that we don't feel like at the moment, right? So it's like the
Yeah.
distinction, right?
Mhm.
So I was thinking like one question to explore maybe later at some point. It's like, is there something that can reconcile these two factors, present and future, like
Mhm.
something that like we can uh, we can I'm exercising even for the sake of now, sort of like
Yeah,
it's come up with a reason that is sort of like can put both these ideas under the same umbrella, so they are reconciled. Uh, that's one thing that probably like that's just an idea that came to mind.
Mhm.
So
that's good. We can talk about that.
Sure.
Do you have anything else you want to say?
yes, one thing else that came to mind when you use the example of moving the chair
Yeah.
and the significance of that, right?
Mhm.
What came to mind was that, well, it's insignificant, right? As
Yeah.
you mentioned. For a person who is, let's say, having some disability, let's say moving their hand, right?
Sure, yeah.
And it's like they're really trying, and it's like they move the chair a little bit, and it's like a big progress for them.
Mhm.
So, in that sense, that is something that sort of significant to them, to that person. So that just came to mind. But overall, what you were saying, makes sense because for your ability, that's nothing. But for that person's ability in comparison to their ability,
Mhm.
uh, that is something in comparison to their ability.
Okay, so we would say it would be necessary, like the chair example is not absolute. So for example, if I was paralyzed and I'm trying to regain control over my limbs and I did that, it's a huge accomplishment. It's like your nervous system is wiring itself together. Like, this is great. Like, if the doctor would be happy, you know? And so it's insignificant for me when you compare it relative to my other movements. It is so minuscule, you know, like me moving my eyes like this, you know? It's just like, it doesn't matter.
In comparison with your ability.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not something, it is not a feat for me. There's no exertion, you know, relative to my specific person. The first thing, so, there's a book called The Willpower Instinct. Kelly McGonigal wrote this. It's part of the program that I have. And she talks about how people are aware of the value almost, I'm going to like paraphrase kind of. It's like, so one thing is if you're cognitively limited and you can't sense the future in the same way as other people can, right? If your executive function can't actually calculate future states. You just kind of live in the present like a goldfish, right? They have like 3 seconds of memory and then it's just reset. Goldfish. That's an existence, right? Humans, we have like the fact that PTSD is a thing, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Is that there was a life-threatening experience. After the experience is over, the person is under distress as if they're still in the experience. You know, they have night terrors, they get flashbacks, like it's a thing. So our memory, our hippocampus, you know, and other modules in the brain, it really can be a good thing. It can help us, but it'll also be a bad thing. And if those memory systems or the executive function are not working properly, then you're like kind of like a goldfish, right? So you may not be able to visualize the effect of your behavior in the future, right? So now one thing is somebody may have just not exercised that part of the brain. It's not that there's a like a wall limitation on it, like the neurons can't grow. It's that they just haven't gotten used to it. They don't really think of it that way. The sociocultural factor, maybe in their family, they just don't talk about that kind of stuff. No, we don't talk about that, right? It's not that their brain is lacking the organelles or the capacity to do so. It's just that it's never worked out. Their muscles are very small, right? So that kind of person can slowly practice and start to understand the value of it. For example, quitting smoking, right? If I have the cigarette and I visualize somebody dying of cancer, right? And I really sit with that, and I don't let the immediate fixation take over my whole existence. And I deal with the dissonance by not compartmentalizing the information, but by accepting that it is this thing that will lead me to that outcome. And so one way I look at it is like, if we have just a regular, like an XY axis, and we're looking for like something like balance. If I put a property here, it would mean that I would have to have a property right there for it to be balanced. So when we go back to this chart, right? If it's the case that, like, let's say there's a predisposition towards ADHD. I'm just kind of boring with it. Like, wow, I exist now, and then it's just hard for me to concentrate, right? That's like saying that there is a negative property in this area right here. And so when we look at all of this stuff, how can I take from these different other properties and put them over here so that the sum of those properties is equivalent to, so this is -8, and then I have a -2, a -4, -1, and a plus 1, and that equals +8. Then we balance the sum, right? And when I write it out like that, like it's like a thought experiment. It's an analogy, right? The only way that you would get an equivalence for that is if the thing that you're burdened with is not a problem anymore. Whether that's like ADHD, cigarettes, crappy attachment style, ambivalent, right? And so I need to learn how to structure my environment, structure my social world, regulate my emotions and stress such that I don't feel the need to be so attached to a romantic partner. This is like an actual problem, right? And when I do all those things, which has taken me many, many years to do, and I still suck at it, then it's not so bad, and you're okay. So balance is one thing, and this is something that over the past, I know it's sometimes I'm fine, but it's fine. Balance is one thing, but balance sometimes isn't even really enough. Sometimes you want extra fuel. And that would be like having not just 0, but like +50. Like if you want to travel to Wasaga Beach, for example, you're like, oh, there's this nice landscape. I'm gonna like be there at sunset, chill out a little bit, have an ice cream, whether it's vegan or not, it's a different thing. And I need to drive there. So I can't go there with an empty tank. I need to have fuel in the tank. So when we look at our goals, where's the G? Look at our goals, it's like it's going to take you, I guess it's over here, future versus goals. It's going to take some fuel, right? It's going to take the development of these skills. You may already have, maybe you were born into a good family of supportive parents. They gave you good habits. You're like, all right, I can do anything in the world. It's like, okay, good, that's great. Teach us, or help us out, be my friend, like whatever it is, right? If not, though, if you're like most of the people in the world, your parents just had you and they're like, you just got to manage this kid until the kid can take care of itself. Okay, then you got to do it yourself, which is totally fine. And so the development and the awareness of these properties, we want to think of it like I'm adding a token into the positive part of my well-being that will really just be utilized for anything that you want. Well, it could be going to buy another pack of cigarettes, but it could also be like making new friends. That's a good thing, right? That's you utilizing a bunch of these properties for the social one. Or it could be me focusing on course content. Or when I did the beat thingy, I added somebody to the live chat. That's what it was. And so there's different things. So one thing is we would say, well, we can determine what a good goal is empirically, right? I can say, hey, it felt really good when I ate this food. Therefore, I'm going to repeat the experience. Or it felt really bad, aversion, when I had this situation occur, right? I had a negative social experience with this romantic partner. And I was like, oh, didn't feel good, right? And so what can I do? What's in my control? I can blame them and say, fuck you, I'm not going to talk to you again. Sure. But then what happens with the next romantic partner? Do I just repeat the same thing? Maybe. Maybe the lesson is don't engage with people to a high degree that display these properties. That might be the case, maybe. But it could also be the case, what have I done to create the situation, right? So it could be empirical. But I can also create goals from like a philosophical principle-oriented approach. I can say, depending on my identity, right, what I didn't control, which is going to set almost like concrete the kind of person I am, and then I'm going to build a structure on those things I don't control. Some things I may not like, and so I counterbalance those things I don't like for whatever reason. It's up to me. It's up to you. You know what I mean? Society might say some things too, and we have to listen to them, right? Like if you're a serial killer and you like to eat people, like you like that, but we're all like, no, we don't allow that here in this world, right? And so there is a balance, but we evaluate the criticism or feedback of others using some principles, right? And what are those principles? Well, one would be ethics. Look at these markers. I just gotta buy some. I'm buying it like as soon as I'm done this meeting, I'm ordering like really good ones. I'm gonna research the best ones. Expo is current whatever. Okay. So we can evaluate some goals ethically. Bam.
Take care.
I'll post it and you can finish it later.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. So we can evaluate certain goals ethically, whether they're future oriented or if they're if they're reasonable, I haven't experienced them yet, or if I've experienced it. Like this harms me, right? That's one thing. Harm, maleficence is an ethical principle. Another, or if it harms somebody else, I hurt you, I'm sorry, right? So I can say that was not, I don't feel good about that, I have remorse, I don't want to cause harm to you, right? In the creation of these goals, that goes back to the meaning in life, which is the purpose. And so the value of the goal is going to increase relative to how much it resonates with me, right? Like your goals, we want it to be for you. That's why it's your goal. If someone else dictates what it might be, so in the workplace, if you're managing a team, if somebody has a motivation to do something, they're like, I feel really strong about this. I know I can do it, blah, blah, blah. They're really excited. And then you go back to the management team and you're like, hey, employee A wants to do job C. And they're like, yeah, but that's out of their job description, right? That's somebody else's job. Therefore, they can't do it. It's just not part of the policy or something like that. Whatever the hell they want to say. That's actually not good. Because someone's intrinsic motivation to do a task is always better than some extrinsic, either whether it's coercive or motivational principle, right? If they feel it internally that they want to do something, it's most likely going to be more effective and better in productivity than if they're just being paid to do it, right? So we would just, the best manager would say, let's rewrite the policy. Don't tell the person who's motivated to do something they can't do it. Just find a way to manage the business differently so we can allow that person to flourish. So, and that's a goal that comes from within that person, right? So basically what we want to do is we want to be able to evaluate the integrity of where we're going. Because it goes back to this, what do I do? Right? That's like something in the moment, like in the present right here. But the nature of time, how this works is the present is not, does the present even really exist? Or is it like this, the past and the future? And you're kind of just stuck in the middle and there is not really a present. You just see it like that, but it's really just this unfolding of the future turning into the past, right? So what do I do is kind of a present thing, yeah, but it will always become something that happened. And it's always going into what it's going to be, right? And so that's why the goals are important, It can be for the immediate experience, but also it's important to, when we go back to the self-talk and the narrative and the coherence of what we're doing, we want to, in some ways, map out how our immediate behaviors and habits all accumulate together towards some end outcome. And when we do that, we establish the sense of meaning. We exercise some control over whatever's going on. And yeah, we really, in the end of the day, increase our well-being. So the next chapter is what goals, what do we talk about for goals? Because all people are human, right? So we have our humans. And it may be the case that there are some universal goals for everybody. Like I said, well-being. So hidden in this is that assumption, is that everybody wants to feel good or be mentally healthy, right? That's just, I'm assuming that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm gonna take that stand and say it's true, right? What else could we say that there is? And the other thing I have as a hidden assumption in this is this structure of identity with the past, the present, and the future, like that whole thing, and how that relates to the self-talk and the narrative. That your meaning, which goes to the property of coherence, your meaning in life will be derived by how you fit all these pieces together, right? And these pieces are like these properties here. I think that's good for this week. Next week, we're going to talk more about goals. I wanted to talk about functions today, but I ended up just doing this for whatever reason. So the function thing is like when you're conscious, so it's like consciousness, and then there's a certain thing that the consciousness is doing, just like habits, or a behavior habit like law in some ways. As the behavior persists, it like turns into a habit. And then there's like the belief and then different information. So that I wanted to get into that. I haven't we didn't do that right now because we did this instead. But yeah. So any comments?
To be honest, it's my first courses, so yeah, it's good. I have a real comment when you finish the knife.
Oh, sure. Yeah. All right. Any comments from online? I guess you missed the beginning of this, eh? It's okay. I might be on podcast mode. Okay, so I'm going to upload this to YouTube soon, and then next week I'll think about the function stuff, and then I'll think about the goal stuff, and then we can continue from there.